Hello, everybody. It is 10 on the nose, and so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar with three of our amazing faculty partners who have led some very interesting research around student basic needs in Kentucky. My name is Lily Massa-McKinley. I'm the Executive Director of the Kentucky Student Success Collaborative, which is an initiative of the Council on Postsecondary Education. And we have been working hard this past year with an incredible stakeholder group across the state focused on student basic needs and how can we increase access to basic needs supports for students and also increase access to postsecondary education for individuals receiving state supports. So this was one element of a project that we did focused on student basic needs that really allowed us to center student voice in the conversation to get a good sense of the awareness of student basic needs resources across their campuses, as well as their experience accessing and taking advantage of those resources and supports. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our faculty partners to share the findings from their research. So Stephanie, take it away.
I'm Stephanie Saulnier, and I'm one of the three faculty researchers. I'm going to introduce us in just a minute, but I'll tell you first what we're getting ready to do. So today we're going to introduce us in the project, and then we're going to do a quick overview of the relevant literature related to the three pieces that we did. We're going to talk a little bit about our methods, how we conducted our research, talk about initial findings, and then finally talk about limitations, implications, and have time for us to do discussion. Throughout the entire presentation, we welcome you to ask questions if you think about them. We'll try to keep an eye on the chat to make sure that we're getting them if you want to put those in the chat, but we're Zitzi, Jake, and I are pretty informal, so we're open to having you all pop in when you want. So a little bit more about us. I am the chair of the social work the Department of Social Work at EKU, Eastern Kentucky University in Richmond. Zitzi Miracore is a professor at the University of Kentucky, and Jake Gross is a professor at the University of Louisville. Zitzi and Jake, you want to pop in and talk a little bit about your research areas?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. So I'm an associate professor of higher ed administration. I direct the Center for Economic Education here at University of Louisville, and I focus on student access and success, specifically for underrepresented students. And I'm a former foster parent, and so one area of interest and research for me is students who've experienced foster care, and of course, there's a lot of overlap with that population and the topic of basic needs. So I'm excited to be here today. It's been a fun project and excited to engage in some discussion and dialogue about this across the state. Thank you.
And hi, everyone. Zitzi Miracore here. I am an assistant professor in the College of Education at the University of Kentucky. And my research largely focuses on K-12 student populations, although I do study higher education a little bit. And similar to Jake, I'm interested in policies and practices that can support vulnerable student populations. And I am a mixed methods researcher, and that was really fun to be a part of this, as you'll see, mixed methods project.
Okay, great. I also am a former foster parent, and foster youth and outcomes for vulnerable students are kind of my area, and I'm an assistant professor. Okay, so talking a little bit about the whole student basic needs equity audit project, which is the big holistic project. There are 4 big pieces of the project, and the one in bold is the piece that Jake, Zitzi, and I were involved in. It's the faculty research on student basic needs availability, awareness, and access. And Lily, did you want to add a little bit more about that, about the overall project?
Sure, I don't mind doing that. Thank you. So we started off this project last summer, and the first bullet point here, we worked with the Kentucky Center for Statistics, KYSSC, on a data project focused on current college students at any of our institutions in Kentucky, and what percent of those are receiving or participating in a public benefit program. And, one of the key takeaways was that we have in Kentucky a pretty significant opportunity to um, to help support more eligible students to participate in public benefit programs such as the SNAP program for food assistance. And so through this data, we saw that 60% of our students attending the community college system are receiving a Pell Grant, which is a proxy for eligibility for benefits. It's not the only eligibility criteria, but it is certainly a proxy for eligibility. And yet only 14% of those Pell eligible students are receiving benefits. And so there's a pretty significant opportunity to increase food security through participation in the SNAP program. Another element of the project was a public benefit policy scan. Comparing the way that Kentucky has, formulated our own plans to implement federal public benefit programs, and also kind of looking at other states and the ways that they have implemented public benefit programs to increase flexibilities for students. And so there was a really wonderful review, and Kentucky is doing great work already in having some pretty flexible opportunities for student support, but there's still room for improvement there. And so we are working very closely with the Department for Community-Based Services to review all of our state plans to look for opportunities to increase access for students. That element of the project also included, not just reading the policies, but really intensive interviews with the key stakeholders at our various state agencies, as well as community organizational partners that are really implementing the public benefit programs on the ground to get a better sense of opportunities for improvement. And then finally, we had an incredible stakeholder group of over 50 statewide partners who participated in a kind of spring this last January through May action network. And the action network was really taking in all of this information from the data, from the research of the faculty, from the public benefit policy scan and stakeholder interviews to create an action plan for Kentucky that's really focused on how do we increase access to basic needs support for students and increase access to post-secondary education for individuals receiving public benefits. And so that group is in the final stages of creating the report, which has incredible, I think, very strong recommendations for our entire state, as well as some critical success factors to ensure that our work is scalable and sustainable. So that report will be released in mid-June, and we will certainly be following up with all of you to share that culminating report once it's complete. Thanks for letting me share, Stephanie.
Very good. Okay, so talking a little bit about the kind of the relevant literature that we use to kind of guide what we were looking at. There's what we know is that students right now in across the nation, but certainly in Kentucky, are struggling to access basic needs services. And when we use that term, we're talking about the things that people need to be in a place where they can benefit from education, right? So we're talking about essential needs such as food, housing, clothing, childcare, transportation, and medical and mental health services. We also looked at access to emergency aid. So if a student was in a situation where they were imminently at risk of homelessness, but $300 could save them, or their car had broken down and they needed money to fix it. Is there that kind of access? There's a lot being published right now about food insecurity, and we know that it's an epidemic, actually, and this is across the board from students that are going to community colleges all the way up to students that are going to four-year both public and private universities, and we certainly saw that across the state. We know that housing insecurity is a problem. This was a significant problem during the pandemic. Universities that might not have recognized homelessness or insecure housing as a problem for students really had to address it for the first time in a lot of cases during the pandemic. More students are working during their college years, and we have a lot more student parents that are going to colleges and universities, and this is particularly true in Kentucky. We know that college students are increasingly presenting in our universities with mental health concerns. Some of these are a result of the pandemic and the impact that the pandemic had on all of us. The other thing that we know is that because peak 12 P12 schools are doing a better job at providing services for students, more students are in a position where they can go to college with a mental health diagnosis. So that is certainly presenting more on our campuses than in the past.
Sorry, everyone. There's so much on my screen. I was struggling to find the mute button or unmute button there. So as Steph said, we use multiple methods to try and better understand what were the services and resources that students used in order to meet their basic needs. And there are two key components to the methods that we used if we think about them broadly. The first is that we used multiple methods to collect data over the course of this past year. And the multiple methods that we used consisted of a website scan, where we searched and organized information about basic needs resources and services that were available on the websites of 2- and 4-year colleges across the state. And we're going to talk about more of each one of these methods in depth. We then conducted interviews with university administrators at 9 partner institutions. These were, again, both 2- and 4-year schools. And these 9 partner institutions teamed up with us and CPE in order to participate in this research. And then finally, we conducted student focus groups. These were in-person focus groups on the campuses of 8 of our partner institutions. The second piece of our methodological strategy, if you will, is that our data collection was very purposefully sequential. So in other words, each step of the data process or data collection strategy informed the next piece of it. So we began the project in the early fall with some draft data collection protocols for all the web scan, the administrator interviews, and the student focus groups, but we modified them along the way as we learned more information. So for instance, when we conducted our administrator interviews in January, February, March of this year, we modified our questions for administrators based on the information we learned in the web scan. And we did the same for the student focus groups, modifying the questions we asked students based on administrators' responses to our questions, as well as the questions that they raised when we were talking to them. And so we really hope that through this method, we're capturing the voices and sort of the immediate concerns of people who were participating in our study. One last point while I'm on this slide. So as you can see here, we collected our data during this most recent academic year, 2022-23. And we're flagging this because we collected data in a arguably unique time period. The peak of the public health emergency caused by COVID-19 had passed, and yet a lot of the fallout of the pandemic for students and administrators remained during this time period and continues to do so. And I think that's important for all of us to keep in mind as we researchers are interpreting and making sense of this data, and as you help us understand its implications.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the website scan that we did as kind of the first part of this project. The idea here was that we would search, hand search all of the post-secondary institutional websites for the 9 partner institutions, primarily to sort of establish a baseline, with the idea being that if a program existed in any kind of formal sense, that it would be necessary, although perhaps not sufficient, to have it on the website. And so we understand there's a lot of information that might be updated on websites, and we'll talk more about that. But this is just sort of a baseline to establish what institutions were saying was available. So in order to do this, we had a team of graduate and undergraduate students who went out and did all of this systematic data collection with a fair bit of training beforehand. And these students were all either first in family to go to college, low income, or students who've experienced foster care. So it was really fun and interesting to have them involved in this project with the data collection. But so what we did is, drawing on the literature that Steph referenced earlier, we first kind of went through and developed a list of what are basic needs, what are different terms or ways that those are talked about. And then from there, with that list, went to the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, or IPEDS, as we call it, and pulled a list of ultimately the 49 public or private nonprofit institutions in Kentucky. Now, we'll just talk about 48 of those institutions for the website scan, because one of the institutions was a graduate-only special mission institution. So we took our search terms and we developed a search protocol that we then piloted on 3 institutional websites. We made some revisions to the to the protocol. And then we had one student go through, and they were assigned institutions, and they looked on websites for evidence of programmatic service in 11 specific areas of basic needs, including whether an institution partnered with a community agency to provide a service, and also whether a general basic needs service, student service point of contact existed. So we wanted to know, was there someone at the institution listed on the website who seemed to be in charge of, or to be kind of over some of the basic needs services. So we searched all the institutional websites using the full list of institutions from the federal government database. And then after we did that, we assigned another student to search the same website. And then after we did that, we randomly selected 10 of the institutions to have a third and different student do the search. So what I'm going to present when we get to the results here, that's how we've collected these data points. And then I mentioned IPEDS. We also wanted to see, with some of the existing data out there, if there were any kind of patterns in terms of what institutions offered relative to the institutional characteristics. So for example, would a public four-year institution be more likely to offer a food pantry? If that makes sense. And I want to just briefly share some information about the overall characteristics of all the institutions in this in the website scan, and then later on we'll sort of disaggregate by some of our findings here. So again, this is basically every institution in Kentucky minus one graduate special mission institution and the for-profit institutions. So if you're familiar with Kentucky, probably none of this is a surprise. If Kentucky higher ed, probably none of this is a surprise. We had a fairly even split in the state between public and private nonprofit. We have more four-year institutions than community colleges. The majority of institutions in Kentucky are not extremely big. You can see here that they range from about 1,000 to around 5,000 students overall. And then finally, in terms of selectivity, this is not a highly selective group of institutions. Now, if you look at the percent admitted, which is excluding the community colleges, of course, this percent of admitted students into the institutions is about 74%. And I think as Lily referenced earlier, there's a fairly high proportion of students relative to national numbers that receive Pell Grants here. Now, this is for first-time full-time students. So 51% of first-time full-time students in Kentucky institutions received Pell Grants, and 97% of students received financial aid.
So following up the web scan that Jake and his team did, as I mentioned, we conducted interviews with administrators at our 9 partner institutions. And the interviews that we did took about an hour, and they took place via video, so like Zoom or Teams. And during the interviews that we conducted with campus administrators, we asked our respondents to first edit the information that we had collected through the website scan, and then to share their reflections about basic needs resources and services on their campuses. So this included asking them to identify the extent to which basic needs services on their campuses were used, and to the extent that they could tell us which students were using them, and to also reflect on the ways in which COVID-19 has shaped the ways in which campuses are both offering student services as well as student need on their campuses. And so just to give you a sense of the characteristics of the administrators we spoke to, we spoke with individuals, like I said, at all 9 of our partner campuses. And these individuals play a variety of roles on their campuses in student affairs, in institutional research, as well as in DEI related positions. And largely the individuals we spoke to for this work identified themselves as women and as either white or Caucasian.
After we did the administrator interviews, the next step was to do our focus groups with the students. And so these were on each of the 8 campuses. We attempted to hold 2 in-person focus groups, one with students who identified as using services, and one more general group of students who may or may not have used services. Points of contact at each campus helped us pull together the groups with some support from us about, suggestions about how to do that. We provided food and door prizes, and we asked in these focus groups, we asked students about their knowledge of and their experience with the support services that we understood to be on campus from the web scan and the administrators. So in reality, the groups in most cases were convenient samples in that they were students that were known to the points of contact, which skewed the content a little bit, or it skewed the information that we got. On a couple of campuses, there was only one group, and in most cases, each group was a mix of those who had and had not used services. We weren't really able to, I think that Jake and Zitzi and I learned a lot about pulling together focus groups, but we learned that or that in most cases, it was impossible to pull the students apart into 2 groups. We had several students in our groups who had worked in support departments on campus, such as residential housing or, in the student success office, those kind of things. But overall, we were able to talk to a good number of students. They were largely female. They were mostly white. We did have a good mix of students that were over and under 25 years old, and they did come from really a variety of different programs and different disciplines, especially at the community colleges. So that was nice. We got a real wide look at, in all cases, we had a wide variety of students that were largely reflective of the overall characteristics of students across our campuses.
Okay, so now we get to the even more fun stuff, the findings of all these the sequential data collection efforts. So we talked about a literature review. We talked about our methods here, just to give you a sense of this is a very rigorous data collection process. And I'm going to start by discussing the results from the web scan. And I think that just kind of for us, I think a key takeaway here is that from the web scan alone and from looking at institutional characteristics and trying to see if there's any relationship there is no clear one discernible characteristic of these institutions or of institutions that suggests that okay, they're gonna be more likely to offer student basic needs services, perhaps with the exception of that, as I'll show here in a couple of slides, that institutions who were part of this partnership. So there's 9 institutions, and you can see those listed here and spelled out underneath this table. These institutions had on average, I'll show it in a minute here, but I believe on average about 2.5 more basic needs listed on their websites than institutions who were not part of the partnership, which may not be surprising, just sort of face value. It's probably institutions that were already interested in this topic and interested in these services that were more likely to be drawn to collaborating on this project, perhaps. But so here, the first sort of way I want to break out the results is this table has basic needs, student support, the different types of student supports in the first row there. Each column represents a different type of support. And I'll note that we sort of listed these out with, food pantry, but we search for more than just food pantry or food stipend. We've searched for food insecurity, and just sort of other iterations of these services at each institutional website. This is simply how we sort of rolled them up and categorized them, again, based on the literature review that I talked about. What jumps out here is a few things, I think. One is if you go all the way kind of into the middle of the table, the most common form of student basic needs service that it was offered among the partner institutions was mental health. Every institution had some sort of mental health service listed on its website. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that they had mental health counselors at the institution. As we dug into these websites a little bit more, some of the institutions outsourced, but mental health was offered by every institution. Emergency aid, medical health, those are the most common forms of student basic needs. And campus employment, work study was offered at all these institutions. Now, there may have been other forms of campus employment too, but if it offered work study, as we would expect most of our public institutions to do, then we counted that as campus employment. I will also note, so I referenced earlier that we were interested in whether the institution had a general point of contact. And why that matters is because you probably know this anecdotally, but we do know it from some of the research on student persistence, that if there's someone at an institution who is in charge of, who is supposed to, their daily job is to worry about whether students are getting through the institution, then that institution is more likely to have a focus on that, is more likely to coordinate those services. Same is true with chief diversity officers at institutions. So that's why we wanted to look at it. Is there a general point of contact? And only at UK, our friends down the road, as we say here in Louisville, have had a point of contact listed on the website. And again, just keep that in mind. This is what is on the website. Now, if you're looking at this and trying to discern other patterns, good luck. We can't, really point to something and say, this is related to an institution being more likely to provide a service. So if you look at public transportation, you have a mix of more urban institutions and more rural institutions there. So, again, I think this is just sort of the baseline kind of surface level, what was available on the website. And I think there's still some more digging to do even beyond this project. Okay, moving on now to, all right, so if we go to table 3 here, if we look at the institutional characteristics in terms of selectivity, graduation rates, retention rates, are there institutional characteristics that are associated with having more services? So again, you see there the acronyms for the partner institutions, along with the number of student basic needs services that we found on their websites. Overall, as I pointed out in one of the earlier slides, with the institutional characteristics across all 48 institutions, these institutions tend to be more similar than dissimilar, similar in terms of selectivity, Pell Grant receipt, and graduation rates. And I will also note that if you are sort of looking here, for example, at percent Pell Grant recipients, full-time, first-time, you'll see we have 2 institutions in there, Bellarmine University in UK, who have relatively low proportion of students that receive Pell Grants. But you will also note that UK has as many services as EKU, which were the two highest institutions at 9. I'm going to pause here, just be very clear. We're not suggesting that one institution is better than another just because they have more services on their website. So this was not a study of the efficacy of these programs, or even the to the extent students were aware. This part was not a study of whether the students were aware of these services. Okay, if we go to the next slide, where we're going to compare partner institutions to non-partner institutions. So again, a partner institution is one of those 9 institutions that participated in the collaborative. Not a partner institution is one of the institutions that did not. You can see there, the top row, that among partner institutions, the number of student basic needs services was 6.89 compared to 3.65. The partner institutions were a little less selective than non-partner institutions. They had similar amounts of students receiving financial aid. And actually, partner institutions had a relatively lower proportion of Pell Grant recipients. But that's why I pointed out those 2 institutions, Bellarmine and UK, that had pretty low. They're pulling the average down there, so to speak. The sector of institutions that were represented among partner institutions, we had a fair number of 4-year institutions, as you can see. 1 private not-for-profit was in there, and then a number of community colleges, probably overrepresented among partner institutions relative to state proportions. And my guess would be that Lily could probably speak to that, was probably an intentional effort to include community colleges, because literature suggested that basic needs are going to be higher at community colleges. And then last but not least, so again, I've sort of talked about, are there clear discernible patterns from institutional characteristics and what we found on the website in terms of basic needs services that were listed. And so what we want to do is really sort of an exploratory model where we're running a regression here, where our dependent variable is the number of services listed at an institutional website. And then we wanted to see if institutional characteristics, such as whether it was a master's institution, or it was a Research 1 institution, was community colleges, private colleges, public colleges, whether spending for student services and academic affairs had any relationship to the number of services that were offered. And so to wrap up here, what we find is that, again, there's a significant difference. If it was a partner institution controlling for all these other characteristics of institutions, partner institutions were more likely to have, on average, 2 more services on their website than non-partner institutions. We found no relationship in terms of student economic need, judged by percent receiving aid, Pell Grant recipient. Found no relationship between those institutional characteristics and number of services that were listed on the website. Now, interestingly, we did find that the private college, compared to the public institutions here, had a statistically significant lower number of services listed on their website. But I think we have to take that with a grain of salt, because there was 1 private nonprofit in this analysis. Interestingly, spending for academic support, instructional support, and student services, there wasn't a clear relationship there. And in fact, only instructional spending and student service spending per FTE had a statistically significant relationship, but it had a standardized coefficient, unstandardized coefficient of 0, which means that practically there was no difference. So pragmatically, there's no difference there. So I mean, I think we were somewhat surprised, and we'll talk more about this in the discussion, but there's obviously more to understand here about why institutions, at least on their websites, list more basic needs services than others.
Okay, so because we finished this research, particularly the student focus groups at the busiest time of the school year, we are still working on the full report, but we have 3 early themes to discuss today, looking at the overall qualitative data. So we're going to talk about those 3 themes. And these are themes that tie directly into the information that we got also from the web scan. And we're going to talk a little bit about responses from administrators and students. So one of the themes is that, and this isn't that surprising, but one of the themes is that the information that was available online is sometimes, and I would go as far as to say usually, inconsistent with the services that are available to students. And this is both in a positive direction and in a negative direction. So if you think back to the information that Jake presented, there were several supports that were found on most campuses. Food pantries, mental health, medical health, emergency aid, public transportation, and Jake has kind of discussed that, and childcare. So as Jake talked about, this doesn't necessarily mean that students were aware of or had access to these supports, or that these supports were even actually on the campus. When we interviewed the administrators, we heard more about how these services were provided. So for example, the mental health, very rarely, it was only in the bigger universities was actual mental health services provided to students in a face-to-face university-based mental health service. In the cases of the community colleges, for example, that was in some cases peer support. In other cases, it was just kind of a hotline. At least one university, students were referred out to local or community resources. So we heard more about how services were provided, and we also heard a lot more about what the services actually looked like. So for example, food pantries, and Zitzi's going to talk a little bit more about that. So when we look at the kind of the sub themes here, Zitzi, we can go to the next one. When we look about, you know, kind of pertinent sub themes under this theme, one of the things that we found is that, with the exception of the University of Kentucky, there is not a point of contact on the campus for students who have support needs. It's really spread out across the campus, and in the cases of several of our universities and community colleges across several campuses. Two of the community colleges that we talked to had 4 or more campuses that they were trying to provide supports to. The other thing that we saw is that there was that knowledge about the resources, or the information that students had about the resources, and in some cases even the administrators, was inconsistent. There was inconsistent about information that the students had, and in cases where we had a faculty member that was in there, what information the faculty members had as well. Especially with money provided through the CARES funding. So this is funding that universities, colleges and universities got during the pandemic. Especially with that funding, in some cases, there were a lot of requirements about who could get what resources. One thing I think we found, though, is that administrators and the actual folks in the universities that were providing direct service to students, who were talking to students in these offices, really were doing anything that they could to make sure that students got what they needed. And so the administrators were not, and Zitzi's going to talk about this, administrators were not slowed down by regulation in finding and using only things that came with specific requirements. So this next slide looks at some of the comments that we heard. On the left side in gray are comments that we heard from administrators, and on the right side in purple are the comments that we heard from students. And overall, what we heard is that administrators are working really, really hard to figure out what students need and to get those services to students. But in some cases, they seem as surprised by what was on the website scans as they weren't completely clear on what the website was saying and what that actually looked like. And a specific example is childcare. So in most cases, the childcare that is available to university students is resources out to referrals out to the community. Although there are some campuses that provide childcare, it's hard to get into and it's expensive. The family houses or scholar houses might have childcare, but it's restricted to a very small group. So in almost all cases, what universities were doing for the majority of students that needed childcare was just giving them a list of childcare providers in the community. And we don't have to talk about, the issues related to finding appropriate, affordable childcare in any community in Kentucky. So students talked about this. Students talked about, the inability to find childcare. The administrators talked about how they utilize those community partners. So something that was on the website might not necessarily be something that the university provides, but something that they help students find resources about. We also found that things like the food pantries are not just food pantries, and these were available at, I believe, all of or almost all of the campuses. And I think in one of the campuses where they did not mention a food pantry in the website scan, they said that they actually had one. But what we found is that the food pantries covered resources well beyond actual food, that they had personal care products, they had diapers, they had clothing, and in at least 2 cases, they had stuff for trans students. So a lot broader than what the website represented. Students, though, talked about a lot about what was actually available. And so they talked about the fact that mental health services were appropriate only in some cases, and for students with more significant mental health needs, what was provided to them wasn't really doing what they needed. They talked a lot about being able to hear about the resources, but not actually being able to find out how to use them, about having to go to various different offices. We had in one case, there was a student that talked about being forced to move off campus during COVID. They were not able to go back home. They did not have financial resources, and their story about trying to go to different offices on campus was really chilling. There were a lot of students that said if you knew somebody that knew something, you were able to get resources. If you didn't know somebody, particularly if you were right in the middle of a crisis, it could be really hard to find what they needed.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So as the second theme that is emerging from our analysis of the qualitative data, and again, we're looking at data from both administrators and students, is that these campus resources and services do seem to be related to the ecosystem of supports broadly in which they exist. And when we say ecosystem of supports, we're talking about practices, policies, resources that can be that exist at both the state and the local level, and that really are instrumental to the opportunities, resources, and services that then colleges can offer their students. Here, and this is in line with what was found as a part of the policy scan, that's a part of this bigger project. Initiatives and services that are funded at the state level are especially helpful. So here's what one campus administrator told us. There's a program called Ready to Work. That is a grant-funded program from the state for students who utilize KTAP benefits and for students who are parents. And it makes sure that they get placed in employment either on campus or off campus. And so this program, as I'm sure many of you know, came up in a number of our conversations that we had with both administrators and with students as a really important mechanism through which they could support their students. In this conversation here, we're elevating these statewide programs because there aren't many other options for administrators on some campuses, particularly those that are outside urban or suburban areas in our state. So as another campus administrator who was at a rural campus told us, this whole county is just lacking. Yeah, I think the people working here do the best they can. There just ain't nothing for them to do much with. And as is implied here, and we learned through other interviews, urban and larger campuses certainly felt like they had more, or administrators at urban and larger campuses certainly felt like they had more opportunities to partner with other organizations, other institutions, and other resources to provide supports for students. And an important component that we're sort of finding as we look further through our qualitative work is the extent to which campus administrators are trying to make use of the wider ecosystem of supports that they have available to them. So we found that wherever they could, campus administrators are trying to forge partnerships with organizations. And these include housing advocacy nonprofits or organizations. A number of our partner institutions work with Family Scholar House in order to provide housing. They're partnering with other post-secondary institutions. So one example here is a 2-year college in our sample that partnered with a 4-year institution in order to provide housing to their students. Campuses are partnering with businesses, local businesses, such as those that provide healthcare or insurance. Campuses are partnering with transportation networks or transportation providers. So those of you who are in Fayette County like me might know that students at UK are able to take or use the Lextran bus service for free. A number of the institutions or campus administrators we talked to reported partnering with domestic violence prevention and or response organizations, which provide a number of basic needs, including food, including hygiene resources, as well as in some cases housing. And then a variety of local and national nonprofits providing an array of different services, such as the YMCA or Goodwill. That's another one that came up. And so the final theme here then we'd like to talk to you about today is the ways in which, as Stephanie alluded to, campuses have been innovating with the services that they've provided through and past the COVID-19 pandemic. And not all of these services or all of these innovations necessarily get captured in, say, an online web scan or potentially in any other way. So this slide illustrates some of the ways in which we saw campuses innovate. First, we saw campuses continually shift what they meant when they talked about basic needs. So on one campus, administrators told us that the pandemic showed them how important computers are and that they're essential for student success. And on this particular campus alone, upwards of 300 computers have been given to students thus far to help them engage with their coursework. Campuses, all 9 campuses where we conducted our fieldwork, talked about modifying in different ways the location, hours, and or modalities of food provision by campus dining operators. So administrators are talking to us about the ways in which many campuses have permanently changed the ways in which students can access food. And a simple example of this is having to-go options for students that have continued even as the public health emergency has been lifted. Many campuses, as Jake or Steph maybe both alluded to, are also relying on external service providers, particularly to meet students' mental health care needs. So across many campuses, mental health is coming to students through online and or hybrid partnerships, including those that might be in their community and some of which are by national companies. And then one campus, a 2-year college, tried to provide emergency housing to their students. And we raised this example here because while the administrators tried to provide the service with all earnestness and effort, they ultimately had to stop offering it. And as one of them told us, or reflected on really, how do we help a student and where do we create boundaries or draw lines? I mean, it's a very tough balance to strike. And we just found that in the scenarios where we became involved, sometimes it was just beyond our capacity to intervene or help appropriately. And what's really striking to us is that the heart of this quotation is a desire, deep desire to help that we saw across the interviews, that both administrators are working hard to meet student needs, and even in instances where they're limited, students across our sample are noticing that and appreciating that. So before we conclude here and really open this up for a conversation and discussion with all of you, we wanted to highlight some of the limitations of the work that we've presented here. First, as Jake mentioned, the web scan that we did may not capture all services. And as we're trying to highlight, this was a period where administrators and campuses were trying to respond to evolving, changing needs. And part of this is also important to note that we capture in the web scan services with a yes or a no, sort of an indicator for whether you did it or whether you didn't. And that doesn't or may not help us look as closely at variation, both within campuses as well as across campuses. So a service might look around mental health care, for instance, might look very different at 2 different campuses, even though it's marked as yes. And this is where we think the qualitative work really helps us dig in there. Steph mentioned this, but selection bias is really, really important for us to attend to. Institutions and administrators who participated in this research might have a disposition, might be more likely to provide basic needs services. And this came up in the chat as well with one of Lily's comments. And then finally, we won't go into details, but I'm happy to talk about it if you all have questions. But as Steph mentioned, student recruitment was challenging for us, especially at the 2-year campuses. And likely skewed the sample that we ended up with for the student focus groups. So we're going to end there and open the floor to questions, comments, and feedback from all of you.
Good morning, everybody. I have a quick question. And it's actually on your last slide where you said that with the population of students that were at the community college level, the data was kind of skewed. Is it because of the quality of the students that are participating, or of the desire of our students actually wanting to participate? Did you find that a problem?
Yes.
The quality was high. The quality of the students was high. The issue was getting students that were willing to participate.
Gotcha. And the reason I asked that is because on my campus, we're kind of like we're a for-profit education, and we kind of operate like a community college, I like to say. But we find that students have a lot of opinion. However, just getting them to actually participate in this survey is one of the hard things. And so I may have 85% of my students that are excited or that are satisfied with student services. However, of the students, I only have let's say 65% participation rate for it. So yes, we are happy that they are satisfied, but at the same time, we don't have everybody taking the survey to be able to truly gauge how to be able to make change, or what services to add or take away, or what the case may be.
Yeah, I'll add to what Steph said with sort of a related challenge is the number of students were taking classes online, or were designated to be on campus on a particular day, which was not the day we were conducting our focus groups. And so part of this was just logistical barriers to doing in-person focus groups on community colleges.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. I was wondering if you all have thought about like research often leads us with more questions than we even started with. So what do you think might be next, or a next step in continuing this type of research?
I'll start. That's a good question. And yes, I feel like it's almost a cliche. It's the favorite thing of faculty to say, but of course, all this research is great, but it leads us to all these other questions, which is often true. But I think at least two directions with this campus website scan. One is that I think it would be beneficial for us to use the same method, but maybe add in another state or two, probably with similar higher ed context, just to see if as we increase the number of institutions, we find that variation to see, given what we would expect is greater variation, would we find any more statistically significant relationships? And then I also think it would be, we've talked about, can we go to the program websites and then have a protocol for determining where they're housed at the institution, discerning whether it's a full-time, part-time staff member or a staff member who's wearing 15 other hats, just sort of digging into those programs more just in Kentucky to get a better sense of what's actually there.
I would like to look closer at the correlation between retention and access to services, particularly for certain population groups. So for example, for student parents, I'd like to break it down and see what is the retention rate for student parents, or what is the retention rate for students who identify as coming into college with a mental health diagnosis, and then look at what services and supports are presented.
In addition to both of those things, I think one thing I would like to do is sort of shift like a lot of our conversation has been around needs, right? What are the needs? How are they identified? And shift that focus qualitatively to the student. So to complement what KY Stats is doing and a different component of this broader project, they're able to look at student level needs. So like, what are the needs that sort of cluster? What are the average set of needs that a student has? And I think it would be really interesting and important to replicate that kind of work at the student level by talking to students. So what are the basic needs you identify as having? And to look at, do we see a lot of students who have, for instance, food insecurity also have housing insecurity? Or are those two sort of decoupled, right? Students are generally pretty stable in terms of their housing, but they tend to have more food insecurity. I think that kind of work would be really interesting for us to look at. And then of course, looking at variation by region, by different institution type, by students' background.
I like that. I think that's a great idea from the standpoint. They are our customer. They are the one that are in need. So if we get a general idea of what everybody needs or feel like a need is to them, then we can be able to pinpoint services that can, basically put those things in categories to be able to say, okay, this is what the students need. We know the basic needs according to what basic needs are to us, but it may be something completely different for students, where they may give us an idea of something that we don't even know. So I do like that, surveying the campus to get an idea as to what they all need or what they see as need for them, and then being able to put that into categories to determine best ways to service them in the long run. I'm excited about this, so thank you. I think this is really good to be able to see from another perspective. I started this position last year, and I've been trying to figure out ways to gather information and to be able to implement things on campus to be able to help students to find more resources and to kind of see how you all laid it out and be able to explain what you found in this. Although some of the stuff may not relate directly to my campus, it's just something that I can utilize to implement on campus and be able to do a better job of doing so. So I like it a lot. So I'll definitely have questions as we kind of continue to talk about it.
One of the things
Bruce,
that I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please.
One of the things that I would like to see in future research is doing programs specific for students who are first generation low income, like the Federal TRIO program, Student Support Services, McNair, Ready to Work, Work and Learn. If they are receiving better basic services than the general population, and if so, what are the differences?
That's such a, oh, I'm so sorry, Donna. If you don't mind, I would love to respond. Just we haven't looked at this formally, but in a number of student focus groups, when we talk to students about who or where they go to for support or help when they need it, students who were in the programs you listed, so the students I'm thinking about right now were in the TRIO program at one of our campuses. They talked about going to a specific staff member who was assigned to help them through that program, right? So potentially these programs in an environment where, as Jake pointed out, basic needs services are sort of dispersed, right? We only have one campus in our sample that has a designated point person. Sometimes the individual staff members who are part of one of these programs end up being the sort of the hub or the connector for students to these other services. Donna, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so realizing that when students have when they're getting ready to enter college or the post-secondary realm, they usually look on websites, and because traveling to every single possible potential isn't really valid, but or isn't really something they can do. But on your slides, and you did note the fact that these statistics, although taken from KYSSC and then also looking on the websites of our area universities, that the information did come from the websites. Was there an opportunity to find out from the administration whether or not they had other services that they just did not have on the website?
Yes, that's one of the things. That was one of the big questions that we asked in the administrator interview. So what we did is we presented them with the information for each university. We presented them with the things that we had found on the website, and then we asked if there was anything missing, and we found that there was. We found some really good information about the ways that they support students, but that were not represented on the websites. And we had a lot of administrators who said, "Oh, we need to fix that. Oh, we're going to need to work with our web, with our web person."
Right. And I think that that's really a disservice then for their university if they don't show all the ways that they can help students be academically successful. And, this is a really important issue to me. It's not the academic side that I find the most interesting. It's this side, and it's fascinating that this is the research that is coming up in order to help students be successful. This is not something that has been researched a lot. And I just find that this side, in order to have a successful student, you need to take into consideration their holistic view and everything that, their background and everything. And I don't think that, until we have more research about this, which is something that I plan to do in my my doctorate program, this this subject is just something that is really, really important to me and important for students to just be successful moving forward. So I really appreciate this information, and I would love to actually get, if it's possible to share the slides, I would love to see them.
Don, your comments and Bruce's comments, a couple of those prompt me. Two things come to mind. One is that we didn't really talk about it, but anecdotally from some of the students, I think they point out the important idea for us to keep in mind as administrators and educators, which is that university websites aren't always the first place a student goes to look for information. So obviously the students mentioned social media and other peer networks, which I think would also be interesting to look at, although that is logistically more complicated than searching a website. And then the other thing I would mention, and Lily, this is going to be a shameless plug for, not for any money, but for the Trellis company, which does work on student financial wellness. They administer a student financial wellness survey. I know it's folks on here, I know who their institution has participated in. I believe all of KCTCS participated. Is that right, Lily? Yeah. So, and just to say, like, so it's free. It doesn't they come in, they'll help administer the survey. And we did that here at U of L 2 years ago. We're doing it again this next year. And it gave us just a wealth of information about prevalence of student basic needs, awareness of resources, their perceptions of how the institution was supporting them or not in terms of basic needs, as well as a lot of other information about financial wellness and affordability and things that I think really important for student success. So I would put a plug in for that. Do it at your institution if you want to get some more information. It doesn't cost you anything.
Did you notice any schools that kind of use social media as their way of communicating with students as to what services they offer? Did you see anything with that, and what's the best way, the most effective way of, I guess, using social media to do that? Because that's something recently I've talked to my marketing director as to how to get that information out. I just don't know how to properly do it. So what kind of things did you find about that?
We found that universities do use social media, and some of them use it quite a bit. The one thing that we found is there is no one way. That students talked about finding information about how we even asked, how do you prefer to get information? We talked to universities about what do you think are the most effective ways, and I'll tell you, there is not one size fits all. In Kentucky, our students are all across the spectrum, the age spectrum, and so they're in all the different groups that use things different ways, that like to get their information in different ways. In fact, I had one student on the Southeastern Community College campus that said he doesn't like to use the internet because it's so erratic up there. So if he has important information, he wants it in his mailbox. So universities are trying everything. We had universities that had kiosks in buildings. We had universities that pushed out tweets and social media things, that sent out email blasts, that did all kinds of different things. And we heard from students that they want a variety of different ways in order to get information.
Yeah, something pretty consistently that came out across the administrator interviews is that students will seek out information essentially reactively, right? So they're in some kind of crisis and they need information, and that's when they're looking for it. And that's why sort of repeated, consistent advertising seemed to be really helpful. So it wasn't just like you put information in a beginning of year email blast to students, right? There was like sort of this, administrators were constantly thinking about, like, how do I keep putting out information about the resources and services we offer so that when a student is in that moment of crisis, they can see the information that will be really helpful to them.
And I just dropped in the chat. So we for different purposes with my department, we've been having conversations about social media, and different groups of students will use it different ways, I think, as Steph was saying, but there is some literature out there about that. So for example, a first generation student may use different forms of social media, of course. So and age matters, and to some extent there's some differences with race and ethnicity. So I had a doc student pull together just a very quick and dirty lit review. Email me if you want me to send you what we've got on that.
I wanted to, I'm going to share my screen once more. These are some questions we had for all of you as you're thinking. We'd love to hear from you about the extent to which the findings we've presented today do resonate and also don't resonate with you. What you see as actionable policies and practices emerging from these findings. And I saw some text in the chat about sort of advocacy, and any additional questions as you've already been asking, we're all happy to answer. And I'll put these in the chat so that I can stop sharing my screen again.
I dropped them in Zitzi.
So one of the things I noticed is a lot of the main schools that when we looked at or that you looked at were, the bigger schools, I would say, the traditional colleges, whereas majority of my students are non-traditional students. So I feel like, a lot of my students are going to keep coming to me for things like housing, emergency funding. And that's like just the biggest things that come to a food pantry, things of that nature. One thing I'm interested in how to partner with other institutions to be able to provide resources for students. Any advice in that regard? Because again, my student base, I'll say 85% of my students are non-traditional students because we're career driven, and all of them need childcare, all of them need housing, all of them need transportation in some regard. So being able to partner with different places, like any advice on how to go about that?
Bruce, that what we found in talking to administrators and the students is that that was really true across all of our campuses, particularly the community college campuses. Okay. So I think that one of the things that we learned that everyone is doing is really partnering with people within the community. So things like the community colleges talked about partnering with Voc Rehab, with the benefits offices in their community, like the SNAP office and the KTAP offices, really forging connections with the Community Action Council in their communities. These are the kind of resources that the folks on campuses are linking students to when they don't have them. So one of the things that we heard in the Action Network is that the child care, the division of child care within the cabinet is really working hard to link low income families up with child care, and that there are resources available, particularly about finding child care. So I would recommend doing what these campus folks are talking about, is just linking up, going around and visiting who's in your neighborhood, who's in your community.
Gotcha. Okay. That's already what I'm doing, so that works. Thank you.
There are also some really exciting partnership opportunities with the Department for Community-Based Services that are emerging. They have always existed, but we're exploring even stronger partnerships between our connector resources in Kentucky, which is a full-time staff position who's dedicated to providing benefits eligibility screening, helping connect students or individuals with a basic needs concern to community-based resources, and even providing training and professional development to a broad campus staff and faculty group around kind of basic needs and security and resources that are available. So that is something where there are dedicated connectors in every community across the state that can come to campuses to provide that kind of information and additional capacity support. And we are looking at opportunities to strengthen that even more especially on our campuses that have the highest numbers of students with significant financial need. So more information is going to be coming around that. But there are definitely, for Bruce and for others, there are some great ways that you can partner through DCBS to build the capacity on your campus already.
And what was the name of that you said you called that? You said a dedicated connector, you said?
Yeah, they're connectors with a KY nectar. And I'm sure that I'll provide some additional information about those points of contact in the follow-up from this webinar.
Perfect. I think I have someone on campus today that's something similar to that, where they're coming to talk to the students about healthcare, just different resources that's available to them, and they set out and kind of broke it down to them.
That's great.
Yes, Connect Health Coverage. That's what it's called. I'm looking at the paperwork here. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, they have connectors for SNAP program, for Medicaid, for the child care subsidy program. They basically help connect individuals with the various public benefit programs in Kentucky.
Perfect. Thank you.
Well, Zitzi, if you don't mind, I would love to just share a little bit about the final recommendations of the Student Basic Needs Action Network to give folks a sense of how this research has really informed the group and what next steps look like. That's all right? Okay, I'm going to share screen. Now I'm down to one screen, and if you've had two screens and then you go to one, life is just it's really, really impossible. So you'll have to bear with me. Okay. All right. So as you all can see this, right? Okay, great. So as I mentioned right at the outset, we had two primary objectives when we started on our basic needs kind of journey to learn more about what's happening in Kentucky and how we can better support students and Kentuckians. The first objective was to increase access to basic needs supports for students. And through the research of our faculty partners, through the policy scan, and through our KYSSC data project, as well as just the discussion of the on-the-ground stakeholders that were part of the Action Network, we've identified 4 critical recommendations for moving forward. One of those is to support our campus partners with implementing basic needs screening and benefits eligibility screening for your students. And this is really driven by overall students are seeking out support when they're in crisis, and that is oftentimes too late. It is very difficult to support students when they only have 24 hours before a major fork in the road in order to really get them connected to the resources that they need in a timely manner. So to provide some of that screening will allow us to much more proactively support students and potentially even provide them a little bit more outreach or case management support in the event that we have that capacity on our campuses. The second recommendation is to work with our Department for Community-Based Services and to review the state public benefit plans and programs. I'm really looking for opportunities to increase flexibilities for students. And we have some incredible partners at the cabinet, and they are very excited to work alongside our higher education stakeholders and other kind of national experts in student basic needs work in order to kind of review our state plans in Kentucky for those opportunities. Third, and this was prevalent in every single conversation we had in the Action Network, and I think also is highlighted in the faculty research that only one of our campuses in Kentucky, clearly identifies a point of contact for basic needs support when we know that the vast majority of students are struggling to have their basic needs met. And so it's very important that we look for opportunities to increase capacity on our campuses to provide the support to students. We know that it is an intensive support that's needed because every student case is unique, and the resources that they may need in order to continue on their education journey are going to be unique to them. So we are certainly really exploring the connector partnership with the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, as well as amazing partnerships with Family Scholar House and other programs and other community-based organizations in Kentucky that can really help provide support on our campus colleges and universities to support students. And finally, and again, emerging from this research, students are most likely to go to a person that they already know and consider an advocate and support person on their campus. And so if they're going to be reaching out to their math faculty member or their academic advisor or, the admissions person that they met, when they first decided to enroll at your institution, we recognize that all of those points of contact or entryways into like a student requesting support, we need to upskill with the knowledge and information and resources so that those folks can make, I guess, really supportive referrals, as well as just knowing how to help a student find the information that they're looking for. And so this recommendation is really around providing more training and ongoing professional development for all college and university personnel, so that they can provide accurate information and consistent support to students. As we move on to our second objective, looking at really increasing that pipeline for post-secondary access for individuals receiving state supports. One data point from the KYSSC project was that I believe 92% of individuals receiving public benefits in Kentucky do not have post-secondary education. And so this is a very large population of folks that are participating in public benefit programs, that they are working with a case manager or another person who can help guide them toward like employment and training opportunities. And so specifically thinking about post-secondary education as one of those opportunities that really leads people out of poverty. And how can we provide more information and resources so that folks can get great information about our programs that exist and how it can help them no longer need benefit support in the future so that they have, great careers. The first barrier that was discussed quite extensively was around childcare, which was certainly a finding from this research as well. And so we'll be convening an important work group that will help explore solutions to the lack of childcare availability and affordability in order to help remove this barrier to post-secondary enrollment. We are also going to be looking for models to strengthen partnerships with both the Department for Community-Based Services as well as workforce agencies that are providing direct support and counseling or advising services to individuals receiving benefits about post-secondary programs and opportunities. Also looking just to enhance this information sharing to provide some trainings and information across partners around the post-secondary programs. I'm sure as much as it might confuse me to figure out SNAP eligibility and how do I then use my CCAP benefit for a child care, like think about college admissions, think about the FAFSA, think about course registration and all of these processes that we put in place in order for individuals to access our institutions. And so that is the same level of information that we need to be able to provide our community partners so that they can best connect students to our staff to provide that guidance. And then finally, and this is ultimate goal of everything that we do around post-secondary education, is that we are really offering this training, this educational opportunities for folks for their ultimate economic mobility and financial self-sufficiency. And so how do we help communicate these clear career pathways that are really going to lead to in-demand job opportunities for folks in the communities where they live? So those were the recommendations that emerged through the Action Network and through all of these incredible discovery projects that helped contribute to our information. We did look at some of the critical success factors as well, which are going to be focused on what are some of these key elements in order for us to scale and sustain this work and ensure that it's high impact for students. And so those critical success factors, there's 5 of them that we identified. One was really ensuring that we do a good job raising awareness of the findings of this work and the recommendations of the Action Network across institutional leadership, organizational leadership, so there's broad commitment to support the work. Second, that we'll really need to identify kind of an infrastructure for this work so that we can scale communities of practice or work groups focused on specific issues. There's a lot of the project management elements in order to do this at the state level. Kind of building on the website asset mapping of campus-based resources, we realize there's an incredible amount of campus and community resources dedicated to this work, but we may not all know where they are and how to find them. And so kind of doing a much more comprehensive asset map across Kentucky of resources that support the basic needs. We talked about communication planning because communications is essential and students like information in many different ways. And we, at the very least, want to make sure that our websites are accurate and that they are up to date and that they create more of an ecosystem of support for our students, as opposed to like, you go to this website for this resource and this one if you need this information. And so, how can we help centralize, consolidate, and make clear the communications for students? And then finally, the incredible resource that we have at Kentucky of our longitudinal data system. How do we really maximize and leverage that so that we can track the impact of our basic needs efforts on ultimate student retention, completion, and economic mobility? And I really truly believe that that is how we sustain this work, because it becomes an essential ingredient in student success. So our next steps with the Action Network, and as we kind of wrap up this webinar, we will be, you now just having registered for this webinar, you will be a part of a distribution list that gets updated on basic needs, next steps, and opportunities to engage. From the collaborative's perspective, we do host a community of practice. It meets maybe 2 or 3 times a semester and brings both information sharing, as well as just partners across the state talking about what they're each doing around the basic needs work and how can we help each other and learn together. So you'll be able to be invited and know when those are taking place if you'd like to join us. We'll also have this final report will be disseminated of our student basic needs work and next steps in mid-June. And so please stay tuned for that. And then also you will be receiving a follow-up from this webinar that includes the recording, the presentation decks that we shared, and some additional resources that may have been referenced. That's all I have. Zitzi, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure. Thank you, Lily, and thank you to all of you for your thoughtful questions and engagement. Jake put his email in the chat. Steph and I will do the same, and you are welcome to be in touch with us with questions, comments, and feedback. And thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.